I'm Katie, and from Triangular Pixels down in Cornwall. We've been doing VR games for a while now, and there's plenty that we've learnt. So hopefully I'll just go through just what we learnt in the social aspect with you today. Starting with accidental social single player. Now, what I actually want to cover are things where if you're inside the same room as someone, you're having a social experience. So this isn't like alt space, this isn't online social, this is all within the same room. So you'd be really surprised what happens when you start just play testing your game and like in the general public. So we used to show things like VR in the bar where you just get some really crazy like reactions from people. And in terms of reactions, you just have to look online, especially when the DK1 first came out and everyone's like, oh, look at these, like look at my mom reacting, look at my grandma reacting. So it just shows that there is something in like this just watching people, this performance. So when we did the London Vive VR Jam a while back, we actually had people crawling around on the floor. They just watching these people crawl was really, really funny. And people on the outside watching them were having a time, just enjoying watching them. And then when the person inside the VR unit came out, they had this shared experience from two different angles. They were like, oh yeah, like I saw you rolling around there, what was happening? And they were talking, communicating, and this is just social in itself. Now this was just because the person inside the VR device was putting a performance on for the person outside. So what you have to start doing is start designing that in mind and making sure that maybe some of the actions that you do inside the game are actually fun to watch outside as well as to do inside. So when you want to start designing your actual experience, you obviously want to try and get everyone involved somehow, not just watching someone roll around on the floor. But when you're watching someone playing VR, you often get a little bit jealous. You're like, oh, what's going on in there? Like, how interesting really is it? Like, you just want to get in there yourself. And if you're not careful, you can be sort of sitting outside and just staring at them going, oh, I wish I was you right now, when's it my turn? And that's not a very good positive social experience, that's a negative experience. And more often than not, what you get on your screen is not necessarily a barreled view anymore, but it's this sort of weird, like undirected camera, and it can be frustrating for people watching it on the outside. It's jerky. You might want to say to the person, oh, can you look behind you again? What was that? It's full of spoilers, and it's not a great experience for people watching it. So what you can do is create a third camera where players can see what's going on, but without that strange warped view. So what we did with Smash It Plunder back in October 2014 was create something called the shared screen, which now Sony calls the social screen, where we just take data from the Gear VR and remap it to a PC version of the game. And this was amazing for us. There was crowds of people watching the player and watching the TV screen and able to join in with the game, despite not actually being able to see directly what was happening on the Gear, because, it's a mobile phone. So what we managed to do was have this 2D map. You can sort of see the sort of white view cone of where the person was walking around. We had high scoreboards, how much time was left, which is really important to see if you're up next, to see when your turn is going to be. And so people are able to say, oh, yeah, the treasure's behind you. Oh, there's another room, go right, go left. And you started getting this even better social experience. Like, oh, good, they're actually talking, actually communicating, even though those outside players didn't have a direct input into the game. So now we pretty much, whenever we show Smash It Plunder, we just show this all the time. It's been amazing for us. And in terms of implementation, it only took about a week's worth of developer time. And we were very fortunate in the fact that the game design just inherently supported it. But there's going to be a lot of games out there that don't necessarily support that. So you've got to have to start, when you're concepting and thinking about your game, is thinking about what you're actually going to show on that screen ahead of time rather than trying to hammer it in afterwards. But obviously, when you're thinking of multiplayer, you're thinking about, oh, what happens? What happens if there's more than two VR units? Because traditional multiplayer is two people on the same pad, on the same type of pads, with the same controls, potentially, working together in the same game, or against each other. But on VR, that's going to be really expensive. Most people aren't going to have two Gear VRs or two Oculus Rifts inside the same house. And then when you've got multiple platforms on top, it's like making sure everyone's on the same platform, or the platforms can work with each other, is going to be pretty much impossible, especially in the same household. So what you're going to have to do is allow players to be able to join in on whatever device they have handy, not just necessarily another VR device. So maybe that's your mobile phone, maybe it's a tablet, maybe it's another pad. So what we did with Double Destruction, we actually ended up using a tablet joined with a Gear VR, so that players can actually interact with each other. We did this for the VR Mobile Jam a while back now. I think it was March 2015. And what happened was that the VR player was actually most of the time in the dark, or at least very, very dark. And the tablet player had to help them by moving a lamp around, showing them the way. And even though the tablet player wasn't directly in VR, they felt like they were part of the same experience and were never isolated. So now you don't have to necessarily have this on a tablet, you can have this on a TV. Just think about, again, the types of sort of peripherals that might be around the players. Are they going to be playing your game in the living room? Are they going to be playing it in VR in a bar when there's a projector or something? But ultimately, not all games now have to be played in the living room or on public transport. There's a lot more going on in the culture of video games. So up in Nottingham, there's an event called Game City, where people can create some really crazy out there ideas for multiplayer games or just single-player games, things that use really different types of hardware. So we really wanted to see what we could do if we just had, like, not a limited time and budget, but at least like a space and just to do something really, really different and crazy. So this is when the National Video Game Arcade came in. They gave us the space and the ability to have other computers networked. And what we did was create Unseen Diplomacy, which was a game where you roll underneath lasers, you dodge past them, you crawl through vents, you go over large ledges. But what we actually had was this big room where we had players being able to join in. And if you were inside the room, you were playing the game. So for the people who are actually outside the device, the immediate VR device, they can join in with a CCTV camera and be inside there. What this allowed was, more often than not, you would have a family come in. And maybe there might be one or two members of the family that want to go on the main hardcore device, but the other ones just wanted to see what VR was like, but not take up the room or take up someone else's go. Or maybe they thought, oh, that looks a bit too much. But the compromise was the DK2. So, oh, okay, well, I'll just preview in here. And suddenly they're in there for an extended time helping out their friends and family. While other people were waiting, everyone was just talking, seeing what was going on. Because we had this shared screen, which was basically allowing players to see what was going on in the Vive device, but without the ridiculous spoilers. We smoothed out the camera, and you see the little reticule in the middle? We actually had that as the one-to-one movement of the HMD. So you don't have to have this jerky movement around. We made it so that we could still see exactly what players are looking at that very moment, but it actually looks cool because it looks like you've got eye tracking. We made sure that we had high scores, and we made sure that the high scores were things like not just the high scores of the day, but also of all time, of the past hour, of the past 5 minutes. Because then you could always basically make sure that your name would always be on a high score board somewhere, at least for the duration of which you were inside the room. We also made sure that when we were typing in people's names for like the high school entry, we would show them who would be coming up next. So there's none of this sort of weird queuing system where everyone has to stand around. Everyone can mingle in the room and be wherever, and then the person's name will come up, and then we'll just go. It's almost like a bit like Argus, I guess, in that way. And then when people were waiting, though, they were still playing the game. We handed out these little evaluation forms, so you could look at your friend and say, oh, no, you're rubbish. You're like a really bad agent. But they're all in really good faith, and it just allowed you to sort of break out VR and make it feel like you were actually somehow still part of the game, even though you didn't really necessarily want to be inside the VR device. So this friend said the agent was best for bait. Very nice of them. But even just going into the room, we actually had like these fake spies set up, sort of semi-interviewed you for the job, as it were, getting your agent name, and that's what they ask for straight away. They ask for your real name, so what's your agent name? They're the ones that also helped you through the experience as well. So it always just felt like those people were from the game somehow, and somehow this whole room was just part of the game. And then as for putting on performance, we had people do all sorts of crazy actions, and this is pretty much like the main spectacle, was just watching other people play. And to have it so that people outside the VR could still enjoy watching people inside and still take part just meant it was an awesome social experience for everybody, not just for the person inside the kit. And so that was it, like this whole room set up as James Bond. It was really, really cool, a really interesting experience. But obviously, it's not something you can do every day. So what can you actually do as developers today to have this sort of experience where people in the same room can enjoy it just as much as the people inside VR devices? Well, Playroom's already showing you how you can possibly do that. So people outside the kit can actually join in on their pads on the TV screen with the person inside the kit. And with the asymmetrical gameplay, it means that everyone could be sitting down together, all on the same sofa, enjoying each other's company and being there with each other. Now, this is actually supported now in the SDK. There's no weird hackarounds that we had to do back in like 2014. So I really want to make sure that you guys really go and look and invest and see what it's like and see what you can do with it. So what about the implementation? So I'm going to get a little bit technical. There's going to be a high hit on your graphical requirements. So for Unseen Diplomacy, you had one camera for each eye, like you do normally. We had our smoothed camera to get some really nice movement, controlled movement. Then we had to render that out to a texture and then put extra UI on, which is a fourth camera. So 4 cameras for the one game. There's not many game engines that could do that efficiently at the moment. We also made sure that everybody had some sort of presence within the game. So the DK2 player was actually that camera that's pointing down. It was like this eyeball and a stick that would look out and watch you as you walked around. And even just a simple model of the avatar, the HMD player, allowed them to see what was going on. We also found that avatars can be really, really simple. So in Double Destruction, this is atrociously small GIF on here, but in Double Destruction, there were a lamp. And just having like this thing respond to you and move to you made it feel so real. So that what we found was we had to make sure that all the actual actions you were doing on the touchpad had to be really one-to-one, so that none of it was smoothed out or anything. So here it may look a little jerky, but at least it's responding to you, and it's responding to you straight away. So players were able to sort of guide each other around by following this lamp. And it just felt humanoid, because what we found was people's personalities come out in how they still move around objects. A really cool example of this was where we found that really playful couples in Unseen Diplomacy would end up sort of trying to poke each other's eyes, and you could see them dodging out the way. You wouldn't be able to do that if they just controlled this robotic thing which moved really, really slowly. Then we have to try and make sure that we avoid what we call the crappy controller. And what I mean by that is, if you can basically play the game by watching the VR screen and also the outside screen at the same time, and controlling the pads at the same time, it might be suggesting that you made a crappy controller. What it means is that when players feel like they're gimped in some way, because it's like, oh, it'd just be much easier if I could just do this myself. And there doesn't seem to be any reason why, other than just artificially you've split up the gameplay, that they are like unable to do that. So they're going to make you feel even disempowered in some way, which is a really negative feeling, especially in VR. In that regard, you have to also make sure that both sides are just as fun to play, that people inside VR are having just as much fun as the people outside VR, which means that you are making sure that people are in control. It's like things like if you're moving things around and you just want to make sure that like they're able to do things within the game themselves. It's not just, hey, can you move this here for me, when I could have just moved it myself in the game. Now, a part of the design is trying to figure out what information is going to be on each side. So what information is going to be seen within VR, and what information is going to be seen outside, and making sure there's potentially a bit of disparity between the two, so that players end up communicating or having to communicate in some sort of way. You want to be thinking about how often you get players to talk, though. Like, if they're talking all the time, then there's potential for miscommunication. It could be frustration. It could be that that takes up more of their brain, basically, talking all the time. But then if you don't get them to do it enough, they're going to potentially feel isolated in VR, or isolated outside, and feel like, oh, there's not really much point of this other person being here. You also have to think about that actually some kinds of information is much harder to communicate than others. You try and explain where to meet someone or where you are in a totally strange place without Google Maps, and it's really hard. Whereas if you tell someone how old you are, where it's just a number, that's really, really easy. So you have to think about how you can apply that to your game. It's like, you don't want to make sure that you're communicating all the time, and then also telling like ridiculously hard information that's hard to communicate. And you also remember there's not just voice. So keeping those one-to-one actions, making sure that players are actually in control and moving things around, will mean that they can also communicate in other ways, like leading a lamp around to show a direction, rather than saying move left, move right, move up and down. The thing that we actually found with Double Destruction, we actually thought it was a bit of a failure in some ways, even though it did win some award. And that's because we actually put the VR player under too much load. We forgot that VR in itself takes up much more proportion of your brain than just playing a normal 2D game. So what we actually had to do was we had like 3 hours to play test it, and we just couldn't fix it in time. It's like, wow, we've put in way too much for the VR player to have to think about. So if we thought and play tested much earlier, then we realized, oh, we put the VR player under too much cognitive load. So that's pretty much, I think, all I've actually got time for. Thank you.
Yeah, it is. Brilliant. Thank you very much. But Katie has not escaped the stage yet, because there's an opportunity for questions, and someone's got to have one. Anybody? One last chance?
Well, so...
yeah, there you go. You've got to answer one. The gent in the blue shirt.
Hi, just around the optimisation, because you had the 4 cameras and that sort of stuff. So what did it actually mean as far as, your geometry, reducing the visuals down and that sort of stuff, or did you find some way of working around that?
Yeah, you can sort of see it a bit there. Go backwards, 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 backwards. So you just look at the artwork for Unseen Diplomacy, and it's pretty bare. Like, we were making sure that pretty much anything under 300 verts, so even on a PC, because it's all running on a ridiculous PC, we're still making sure everything would batch as much as possible. We really had to make sure there was only like 1 or 2 lights in the scene, because otherwise it was just going to get out of control. Like a lot of things, we just turned shadows off, making sure that we're deleting back face edging and things like that. But, I mean, otherwise, we're very fortunate in the sense that because of the weird nature of the game where you were doing this redirected walking, we were loading in and out rooms. So really, it was only a few rooms which were actually a bit bigger that was a problem. In these really tiny little corridors, it wasn't too bad. And I think ultimately, we only did it in a month, so didn't really get a chance to investigate any other way of doing like a 4th camera, or not having to do a 4th camera. But potentially with layers, you could get away with just the 3rd camera somehow. So only that 3rd camera would see the UI and just have it attached to that camera somehow or something. But we just didn't have time for that, so we just rendered out to the texture and put the UI on and then do it again.
Nice one. Any more questions? Sorry, right behind the person with the microphone.
You showed one of the examples where you had like a map, and it was a much more stripped down interface, so rather than seeing what they see, you just see something a bit more abstract. Was that running on the same device as the person in the VR, or was that like a separate machine running that?
That was actually a separate machine. So we created a PC version which, I mean, we're debugging and stuff all the PC all the time because that's just insane. But so there's PC version that had like a different camera, and that we sort of clipped out a load of stuff that we didn't actually need. And then it was literally just taking the data like from the Gear VR, you know, just the orientation data to a PC version just over a network, and it was over LAN as well. But then we moved that to a mobile phone. That was actually pretty quick. I think it only took like a few days to move onto a tablet. So anything that is now on the same Wi-Fi can have that screen, which is really, really so useful because it means you can come to an event, show off what's happening on the gear without actually somehow needing to Chromecast it. And it had no performance hit, really, because it was only like minuscule bits of data that was being sent, not a whole video stream, which is what you normally get when you're trying to Chromecast it or something.
Yeah, would you say that's more efficient than trying to render multiple cameras on the same machine, actually having a few linked over a network?
From our current experience, it's probably easier in some ways, but then again, the other half is a network programmer, so it's much more naturally comes to him, I guess. I mean, I guess in terms of, yeah, I mean, it's what you're after. Like, having to support effectively a different version of the game can be more expensive than just having, like, being really smart with your layers in Unity and things. But that can also, that can get really messy, and Unity only has so many layers. And you have to think about ultimately what the end user is going to be doing. So with PlayStation, you're not going to be having a networked PlayStation 4, like another PlayStation 4 to do it. You're going to have it all on just the TV screen, and in which case you can't have the network layer because there's nothing to network to. So yeah, just think about how it's going to be done, because, you know, on the Gear, that's impossible. You have a separate thing, a separate app.
Fantastic.